The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the distinguished ranking member from Massachusetts, my good friend, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself as much time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all other members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Resolution 83 provides for consideration of 2 resolutions under a closed rule. They are House Concurrent Resolution 9 and House Resolution 76. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and in support of the underlying resolutions. HCON Res 9 is a simple resolution denouncing the horrors of socialism in all forms and opposes the implementation of socialist policy here in the United States. This resolution should not be controversial. Socialism is a harmful ideology that is opposed to everything the United States stands for. Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin both described and demonstrated how socialism is a transition period between capitalism and communism. And we've seen this time and time again. Socialist ideology creates a concentration of power that leads to communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorships that deprive their citizens of basic freedoms and human rights. We've seen the horrors of communism through the tens of millions killed by regimes in China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Horrors that some of my colleagues across the aisle refused to even condemn yesterday during the Rules Committee hearing on this. Even today, hundreds of thousands of Russians, Chinese, Cambodians, Koreans, Cubans, and Venezuelans have fled from murderous communist dictatorships and have legally resettled here in the United States. They are a living testament to the barbarity of these socialist regimes and the promise of the American dream. It's essential that Congress condemn the atrocities committed in the name of socialism and prevent any socialist policies from being implemented in the United States. Additionally, the rule before us provides for consideration of H.Res. 76, a resolution that would remove Representative Ilhan Omar from her seat on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Representative Omar has a repeated history of making deplorable and despicable anti-Semitic remarks and does not deserve to sit on the committee directly overseeing U.S. international policy, partnerships, and national security. In fact, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, a Democrat, Representative Eliot Engel, claimed that such comments made by Representative Omar have, and I quote, "no place in the Foreign Affairs Committee or the House of Representatives," end quote. Compared to the actions taken by my Democratic colleagues last Congress, I think that we Republicans are being incredibly generous in only removing Representative Ilhan Omar from the Foreign Affairs Committee instead of from all her committee assignments, which we are clearly in our right to do. I urge my colleagues to support this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania, my good friend, Mr. Reschenthaler, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. I'm confused, Mr. Speaker, because after months of hearing from Republicans that they want to address bread and butter issues, that they want to do something about the issues facing everyday people in this country, the issues that we hear about when we go home, we are here instead wasting the time of this body with 2 useless, stupid political stunts, which are about dividing people, distracting people. Make no mistake, these are Fox News talking points, Tucker Carlson sound bites, press releases. That's what they are. And the reason why is clear. When Democrats were in charge, we had one of the most productive Congresses in history. We passed the biggest climate change bill ever. We passed the biggest infrastructure bill since the interstate highways were built. We passed a bipartisan gun violence bill, stood up to greedy corporations, lifted kids out of poverty, brought jobs and manufacturing back to America. And what are Republicans doing? What are they pushing instead of kitchen table issues? Conspiracy theories, nationwide abortion bans, a 30% national sales tax on groceries and gas, cuts to Social Security and Medicare, giveaways to billionaire corporations so they can cheat on their taxes. That's the kind of garbage that they're wasting the American people's time on. H-Con Res 9 claims to denounce the horrors of socialism. What is this, the Red Scare? I mean, I have to say this is about the stupidest bill I've ever seen. Just a stupid, stupid, stupid bill. And let me just say to my Democratic colleagues, vote however you want on this. Doesn't matter because it does nothing at all. Oh, it denounces Pol Pot. Of course we denounce Pol Pot. I've never heard anyone say anything nice about him. We denounce Stalin. Didn't know that that needed a resolution. We denounce Kim Jong-un. Well, not all of us, actually. Because, in fact, if I remember correctly, it was the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, who said he fell in love with him, who talked about how talented he was, who called him a great leader, who bragged about their chemistry. Did any of my Republican colleagues speak up when a brutal tyrant named this resolution was applauded on the world stage by the President of the United States? Did they denounce that? You know what's interesting, Mr. Speaker? One name I noticed was missing from this list, Vladimir Putin. Like, what's up with that? I mean, we condemn Lenin and Stalin, but not Putin? Is that like a Trump thing? Did he put in a call? Seriously, why is Putin left out? And by the way, this isn't just a stupid bill, it's a badly written stupid bill. It lays out all of these awful people and then says we're, quote, rejecting the implementation of socialist policies in the United States of America. And nobody, not a single person so far, has been willing to clarify for me what exactly that means. What the hell are they talking about? Are we talking about public schools here? Fire departments? Roads? What about Medicare and Social Security? Republicans have called Medicare and Social Security socialist programs for years. So we would just like a little clarification here. And we got none last night in the Rules Committee. None. We even tried to include an amendment to clarify that the language here does not imply cuts to Social Security and Medicare. And every Republican, every single Republican on the Rules Committee voted no. So there's our answer. There's our answer. And here's what I think. I think this is about scaring people, and it's about dividing people, and it's about distracting people, which brings me to our next resolution, which removes our colleague Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I mean, the hypocrisy here is staggering. I mean, it literally takes my breath away. Congresswoman Omar has apologized for the things that she said. She said she wants to be an ally in the fight against anti-Semitism. She even voted to condemn anti-Semitism. Every Democrat did as well. You know who voted no? 23 Republicans. 23 Republicans voted against condemning anti-Semitism. Now, maybe the gentleman can explain whether or not they should be removed from their committees. And then, we gave our colleagues in the Rules Committee the chance to add an amendment to their socialism resolution condemning the mass murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazis, also known as the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party. And guess what? They all voted no. They all voted no. Oh my God, wow. I mean, I keep hearing this both sides stuff, trying to make false equivalences, saying that Democrats opened the door to removing her. Give me a break. Congresswoman Omar never posted a video pretending to kill another member of Congress. She never advocated putting a bullet in the head of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. She never had dinner with neo-Nazi Nick Fuentes and anti-Semite Kanye West. She never spoke at a white supremacy conference. She never said that she would have won January 6th because she was armed. No, those are things Republicans have done and have said. And I will ask again, why aren't those members being removed too? So please, to my friends on the other side, please spare us the absurd comparisons and lectures about anti-Semitism. Republicans refuse to condemn anti-Semitism. Republicans refuse to add an amendment condemning Nazis to this socialism resolution. Republicans have been silent while members of their conference say things that are blatantly anti-Semitic and appear beside Holocaust deniers and bigots. These are awful, awful bills designed to divide and distract people. And I get it. I mean, I get why. I'd want to divide and distract people too if my agenda was as extreme as the agenda that the Speaker of the House is now advocating for. They've spent their entire time and power so far pushing for higher gas prices, higher middle-class taxes, higher inflation, and higher drug costs. They're screwing working families, screwing poor people, and using stupid BS like this to distract from their plans to reward billionaire corporations and hurt working families. And in the middle of it all, they're threatening to trigger a default if we don't cut Social Security and Medicare. Now, we can waste all the time in the world on these resolutions. And on the socialist resolution, again, I don't even care how people, it is such a waste of time. People can vote any way they want. I just may have made it a habit to always vote no on stupid bills. But this is a waste of our time and a waste of the American people's time. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind my good friend from Massachusetts that I don't think you'll find anybody on this side of the aisle or in this chamber that's more of a hawk on Russia than me and Vladimir Putin. I'd gladly condemn Putin. And let's not forget, Putin is a communist. This is a man that started his career as a KGB agent. So this resolution clearly covers Vladimir Putin. We all condemn him. Additionally, I'd like to remind the gentleman that the first time I ever spoke on the House floor, I waited weeks to speak as a freshman. The first time I spoke, though, was on anti-Semitism. I spoke to condemn the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania. So I'd like to remind my friends across the aisle that we have been mischaracterized by some of the comments that were just said. But let's talk about who won't condemn socialists. We had a ranking member, a Democratic ranking member in the Rules Committee hearing yesterday, who was given the chance to condemn Xi, would not do it. Chance to condemn Putin, would not do it. Chance to condemn Pol Pot, wouldn't do it. And a litany of other socialists and communists. So I would just like to remind my friend from across the aisle that members on his side refuse to condemn socialists and communist dictators. But I find it rich that there's a question over the definition of socialism. Remember, for the last 2 years, my friends across the aisle couldn't even define the term woman. We had that rigmarole where they couldn't define woman and refused to acknowledge science that there were different sexes. But now they can split hairs between the difference between socialism and communism. It's absolutely laughable. But let's just define socialism since we're here having this debate. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned by the community as a whole. And it's not me saying that socialism leads to communism. That's Marx saying that. That's Lenin saying that, because part of their entire theory was you had a transition period between between capitalism and communism. That transition period, they called, again, Lenin and Marx, they called that socialism. So let's be very clear what we're talking about. Let's not play games with language, especially when we can't even define incredibly basic terms that even kindergarten students could define. But let's talk about what Representative Omar has said, talking about that, because I think it's important to put this in context. In February of 2019, Representative Omar tweeted, and I quote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," in reference to American support for Israel. She said that AIPAC was buying U.S. representatives. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the entire Democratic leadership actually condemned Representative Omar for these anti-Semitic comments. Then, again, just to show this is a pattern, this isn't some one-off incident, February 27, 2019, she doubled down on her stance at a forum in Washington, D.C. when she said, and I quote, "I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country," end quote. Clearly, she's going back to the trope that Jewish Americans have a dual loyalty between the United States and Israel. That offended Chairman Eliot Engel, who at the time was the Democratic chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And he said, and I quote, "It's unacceptable and deeply offensive to call into question the loyalty of fellow American citizens because of their political views, including support for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. We all take the same oath. Worse, Representative Omar's comments leveled that charge by invoking a vile anti-Semitic slur, end quote. Again, that's not me saying that. That's a former Democratic chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Further, in March 2019, Representative Omar trivialized the terrorist attacks of September 11th that killed just about 3,000 U.S. citizens by describing it as, and I quote, "some people did something." Her words. In 2021, a few months before the death of 13 service members during the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, Representative Omar compared service members of the United States and the Israeli Defense Forces to terrorist groups like Hamas and the Taliban. She tweeted, and I quote, "We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban," end quote. To think that a representative here in this body would equate the Israeli Defense Force and the American service members to Hamas and the Taliban speaks volumes. It's unacceptable. That person should not be on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Representative Omar's Democratic colleagues sent a statement asking her to clarify those remarks because it was offensive and misguided. Again, the words of my colleagues across the aisle about Representative Ilhan Omar's words, and she refused to apologize. In May of 2021, Representative Omar accused Israel of committing war crimes following days of conflict between Israel and Hamas, where Hamas was launching rockets into Israel that saw thousands of missiles fired indiscriminately at Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, killing civilians. And she described Israel's defensive posture as war crimes, saying nothing about the terrorist attacks of Hamas. So spare me the false outrage over her comments. She has proven time and time again that she should not be on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend from the state of Florida, Representative Maria Salazar. 5 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of the rule to bring up to the House concurrent resolution number 9, denouncing the horrors of socialism. And why am I bringing this resolution to the floor of the United States House of Representatives? Because young people in America are being brainwashed by the news media and academia into believing that socialism is an economic model for the greater good of all Americans. And the problem is that they're falling for it. They're believing it. And here is the proof. Almost 40% of Gen Z and millennials think the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx, the father of Marxism, is a better defense of freedom and equality than the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, one of the creators of the American experiment, the American exceptionality, and the document which gave birth to the most prosperous and resilient democracy in the history of the world, ours, the United States of America. Worse yet, in a recent poll that shows that 40% of Americans of all ages, not only the youth, 40% believe that socialism is good, while 33% of them say that they are likely to support a member of the Democratic Socialist of America, the organization that has shaped the ideology of many of our colleagues with the poison of neo-Marxism. If you go to their website, to the Democratic Socialist of America website, you will read their neo-Marxist positions with pride. I represent District number 27 in the city of Miami, or in Florida, the city of Miami, a bastion of hundreds of thousands of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who have fled, who have escaped from the despicable horrors that you cannot imagine produced by that ideology. So why did the Venezuelans flee? Well, because Venezuela, why would they do that if Venezuela has almost 20% of the world's oil? In other words, that means the largest reserves of oil in the world. The Venezuelans have more oil than the Saudis in Saudi Arabia. In the 50s and the 60s, they had the same GDP as Germany. Now, inflation is 156% a year, the third largest in the world. The average Venezuelan has lost 15 pounds for lack of food. In the last 20 years, over 7 million Venezuelans have escaped the democratic socialist paradise anywhere they could go. That is more people than have fled the violence in Syria. So that indicates that socialism is more devastating than a civil war. Another country who has lost everything is Nicaragua. In the 70s was the breadbasket of Central America. But then the Sandinistas arrived. Daniel Ortega took power under the guidance of Fidel Castro in Cuba. He expropriated almost 30,000 properties in a few years. Right now, their citizens are poorer than they were in 1977. But Ortega promised democratic socialism, but delivered a dictatorship. In the last presidential election, 7 people dared to run for president, and he put them all in jail. Still today, they're either under house arrest or in jail. Every socialist is a dictator in disguise. In Cuba, after 60 years of living the socialist paradise, the average Cuban, 70% of the Cuban eats only once a day. The average Cuban makes $23 a month, that is 40 cents a day. And the retirees, the seniors, make $12. Cuba in 1960 had the highest per capita income in the hemisphere, and it was comparable to Italy. And we know that because there is hunger is a very powerful motivator. So today, Cubans by the thousands throw themselves to the sharks in the Straits of Florida looking for freedom and hoping to get to the district that I represent on this floor. And that's just in this hemisphere. In China, 55 million died. In Cambodia, 1 million. In the USSR, 10 million froze to death in the gulags. Socialists are in the business of power, and it only takes one generation to believe their false promises and lose our freedom. It is a lie that socialism will solve your problems, economic or social. And if it's democratic socialism is socialism, and socialism is always socialism. We cannot let this evil ideology take hold in this country. We are in the United States, the stronghold of freedom. That is why we must pass this resolution. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, I listened to this debate and I get more and more confused. The gentleman from Pennsylvania said that Vladimir Putin was not put on this list because he's a communist, yet the gentleman mentioned communism several times. The gentlelady just talked about the Communist Manifesto, and I'm looking at the list of people that are mentioned. Among them is Pol Pot, who was, I think everybody believes, was viewed as a communist. So again, I'm just trying to figure out, like, why wasn't Putin included on this list? Did somebody get a call from the Mar-a-Lago prison line that you couldn't put Putin on this list? I mean, what was? I don't quite get it. And again, I'm also just stunned that last night, we offered the Gottheimer Amendment, and this language basically says that fascism led to the murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime. Everybody on the Republican side voted no. And this is like, and again, we asked for some clarification on really what the guts of the bill was, which is the resolve clause. What are you talking about? What policies are you against here in the United States? And we asked to make the Takano Amendment in order, which would basically say that Social Security and that Medicare would be exempt from any cuts, that this was not what the intention was. And every one of the Republicans, every one of them voted no. There was a gentleman who just came down on the floor saying, I don't know why everybody's saying Republicans want to cut Social Security and Medicare. You know why? Because of what happened last night in the Rules Committee. Mr. Speaker, last night, as I mentioned, the Rules Committee, the Democrats offered an amendment that would clarify that any opposition to socialist policy implementation in the United States does not include existing federal programs such as Medicare, Social Security, TRICARE, VA health care, and VA home loan program, VA burial benefits, and VA homelessness programs. My Republican colleagues voted against it. Well, we want to give them a second chance to get this right. So if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to this rule to include this important amendment and give every member on the floor the opportunity to clarify that existing federal programs like Social Security and Medicare are not under attack by this new Congress. And, forgive us if we are concerned, but rhetoric from many members on the other side of the aisle, past and present, give us pause. Republicans have called Social Security a socialist program. I remember when Newt Gingrich wanted Medicare to wither on the vine. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment into the record along with any extraneous materials immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Social Security is the bedrock of our nation's social safety net. Since its inception, it has lifted millions of our seniors out of poverty, protecting the benefits, the benefits and other programs should be a priority for this Congress. As my Republican colleagues demand reckless cuts in exchange for paying for our nation's bills, we on the Democratic side are going to remain unified and doing everything we can to protect these important programs. To discuss our proposal, I yield 3 minutes to the amendment sponsor, the gentleman from California, Mr. Decano.
Gentleman is
Thank you,
recognized.
Ranking Member McGovern. Mr. Speaker, I had hoped to rise today to offer an amendment which was a clarifying amendment, which would have clarified what the resolution before us today meant by the word socialist or socialism. None of us have any objection to, in fact, embrace the whereas clauses. We condemn egregious examples of totalitarian authoritarianism and the excesses thereof. But we're very concerned about what the resolve clause means and the way socialism is defined. There are many ways to look at socialism. And my amendment simply was to clarify that the implementation of any opposition of socialist policy in the United States does not include federal programs such as Medicare, Social Security, TRICARE, VA health care, the VA home loan program, VA burial benefits, and VA homelessness programs. But you know what? Unfortunately, the Rules Committee last night blocked my amendment. And the rejection of my amendment sends a clear message to the American people under this Republican majority. Social Security and Medicare and veterans benefits are not safe because they construe those to be socialist programs. This resolution being considered today is really ridiculous. It dishonestly conflates any effort to improve the lives of Americans with the violence of totalitarian communist regimes. Without my amendment, it can only be read as an attack on Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits. The programs my amendment specifies helps veterans receive health care, aid struggling families who have fallen on hard times, and support millions of Americans by ensuring they receive the benefits they have spent their life working and paying for. Medicare, Social Security, TRICARE, VA health care, the VA home loan program, VA burial benefits, and efforts to end veteran homelessness are programs every member of this body should be proud to support, but instead, my colleagues on the other side have spent years attempting to undermine and dismantle them, and they're doing it again with this so-called resolution. This so-called anti-socialism resolution is simply the latest volley in an assault that goes back decades. And despite these attacks, the programs my amendment defends are overwhelmingly supported by the American people. Americans know that these policies work, they're practical, they're beyond ideology, they're simply common sense, and they want to they want us to join us. The people want us to join together and bolster them and expand them, not to denigrate and defund them and play stupid games to distract and do red herring amendments such as this to get us off the track of working for the American people. Thank you. Now yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know why we're here today. We're here to condemn socialism. And let's not play games. We know what socialism is. And despite knowing what socialism and communism is, you're going to see Democrat after Democrat come down here on the floor and refuse to vote to condemn socialism and communism. And let's talk about what that means. Mao Zedong, in his socialist revolution in China, you had 55 million people starve to death in the wake of famine and devastation caused by the so-called great leap forward in China. And you're going to have Democrats come to the floor and refuse to condemn that. Let's talk about Joseph Stalin. And by the way, history lesson, FDR, a Democrat, would refer to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe when he was trying to make this ruthless thug more palatable to the American people. Again, a Democrat praising Joseph Stalin, but I digress. Under Stalin, tens of millions died in the Bolshevik Revolution. At least 10 million people were sent to gulags in the USSR, and more than and millions starved to death in Ukraine due to forced famine. Pol Pot eliminated 1/4 of the population in Cambodia, 1/4. And again, you're going to have Democrats come to the floor and refuse to condemn that. Due to socialist and totalitarian policies, over 75% of Venezuelans currently live in poverty. Only 3% of Venezuelans consider themselves food secure. This was the largest GDP in South America before Chavez took over. And now they're literally eating their pet dogs to stop starvation. Marxist socialist policies and communism regimes are responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths worldwide. And again, my Democratic colleagues will come to this floor later today and refuse to condemn it. It's truly astounding. 3.5 million have starved to death in North Korea just since the 1990s alone. In the current communist regime in Cuba, the government continues to repress and punish virtually all forms of dissent and public criticism as Cubans endure the worst economic crisis seen in decades. And again, Democrats will come to the floor and refuse to condemn that. During Castro's rule, thousands of Cubans have been incarcerated in abysmal prisons, thousands more were harassed and intimidated, and entire generations were denied basic political freedoms. And again, my Democratic colleagues, some of them will refuse to condemn that. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, my good friend, Mark Alford.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a lot of confusion today, a lot of bewilderment, a lot of dismay from our friends from the other side of the aisle, and exactly why we're here today. I'm here to tell you it's a shame we have to be here today, that we have to publicly put everyone on record to denounce socialism. I rise today in somber support of this resolution, a resolution to denounce the evils, the horrors of socialism. Mr. Speaker, this is a somber issue because our nation was founded on the principles of liberty and freedom, enshrining our founding documents as the thesis of our very nation. However, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here have made light of the horrors of socialism and at times have advocated for this radical ideology, to the point that the youth of our nation have been deceived. They begin falling away from the true ideals of the freedoms on which our nation were founded, that being liberty, democracy. So let me clear up some of this confusion for our good friends. This cannot happen. We can never let it happen again. Socialism has created famine, mass murders, the killing of over 100 million humans around the world. Many of the worst crimes in history were committed by socialist ideologies: Stalin, Mao Zedong, Castro, Kim Jong-un, Maduro. And yes, I'm here today to tell you that we also condemn uncategorically any forms of socialism, including Vladimir Putin. This history cannot be forgotten. As socialist regimes have indefinitely led to the destruction of personal liberties and are still a constant threat, future generations must be taught, they must understand the horrors of socialism. So we stand here today. It's a shame we have to be here to do this, to teach this lesson, to denounce the horrors of socialism, to protect the freedoms of our great nation, and take a stand for personal liberty. Our young people have been led astray. Our nation has been blinded to some degree, and it's time to lift the scales off those blind eyes. It's time that every American take a stand. It is time to tell the truth. The truth is the only thing that matters. And the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that socialism is evil. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Yeah. This is a strange debate, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the gentleman said that he personally condemns Vladimir Putin, but it still doesn't explain why he's not on this list. If everybody condemns Vladimir Putin, then why isn't he on this list? There are other communists on this list. And if we're going to condemn communism, fine. But communism isn't mentioned in his resolution. And people were talking about supporting capitalism, and capitalism is even mentioned in this resolution. So this is a stupid resolution that was written poorly to begin with. And again, I would say to my colleagues that we gave you an opportunity to expand the list to include the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which are the Nazis, who were responsible for the killing of 6 million Jews, and everybody voted no on the Republican side. I just can't get my head around why that was such a controversial addition. And our concern about this bill, and this is an interesting back and forth on history, and by the way, when I go home, people are not bringing up Stalin and Lenin and Pol Pot all the time. They are bringing up Putin, and they are concerned about what he's doing in Ukraine. And maybe the reason why Putin is not on this list is because the other side of the aisle is divided in their support to help protect the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. And maybe that's what we're going to see coming down the road in terms of budget cuts. I also want to say, I want to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert into the record a piece by roll call entitled House GOP Overlooks Internal Anti-Semitism, Points at Democrats. Mr. Speaker, House Republican leaders have repeatedly declined to condemn and punish anti-Semitism, hate, and violence pushed by members within their own party. I'd like to insert this in the record.
Without objection.
Yeah, and again, my concern, I don't care how people vote. This is a meaningless, ridiculous waste of time. But my particular concern with this resolution is not all the whereas clauses, it's the resolve clause. It's the resolve clause. And many of us are concerned because of the rhetoric on the other side of the aisle, because so many of you have referred to Medicare as a socialist program and Social Security as a socialist program. We asked last night simply to reassure us, and we had an amendment. You heard the amendment, Mr. Takano spoke about it, that none of this has anything to do with Social Security and Medicare. And guess what, everybody? They all voted no. All voted no. So that's what our concern is about. And people can say whatever they want on this. I mean, I can't believe with all that's going on in the world, we're spending a day talking about this. But whatever. This is the new Republican list of priorities, and there's no wonder why the poll just came out showing that the majority of American people do not share the views and values and priorities of this current Republican House. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to hear that people in Massachusetts are not talking about communism. But you know where they're talking about communism? Places like South Florida, places like Miami. It's because, unlike those in Massachusetts, they experienced communism. They've experienced socialism. Ask any Cuban refugee. That's why you have individuals here like Mario Diaz-Balart, like Maria Salazar, like Carlos Jimenez that represent those districts. This is an issue to a lot of Americans because they never want to see the horrors of socialism and communism here on our shores. But it's just not Cuba. Let's talk about China, because my friends across the aisle always hesitate to criticize and condemn China. It's quite remarkable. China has deprived 1.4 billion human beings of their fundamental human rights. Since March of 2017, China has detained and persecuted 1.8 million Turkic Muslims, the Uyghurs. And they put them in so-called political re-education camps. We all know what those are. Those are death camps, those are gulags, and the Chinese have them in their western province. In the world is silent on it, and my colleagues from across the aisle refuse to condemn socialism. Those Uyghurs being held in the western province without due process. They're being forced to engage in labor, forced organ harvesting. They're suffering atrocities like torture. And yet again, my Democratic colleagues will refuse to condemn socialism today. The CCP hasn't just violated the rights of the Uyghurs in Western China, they've also subjugated Tibet. It used to be a cause célèbre for my friends across the aisle to talk about freeing Tibet. When I was growing up in the 90s, you saw the bumper stickers everywhere. Where's that outrage now from my Democratic colleagues? Why won't they call out China? In Tibet, the CCP has engaged in severe repression of the Tibetan unique religious, cultural, and linguistic heritage, and is engaged in gross human rights violations in Tibet, including, but not limited to, extrajudicial detentions, disappearances, and torture. Elsewhere, the CCP is widely alleged to be a major harvester and trafficker of forcible acquired organs. Organ harvesting targets minorities, including the Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Tibetan, Muslims, and Christians in China. Yet where's the outrage from my friends across the aisle? Why won't they condemn socialism here today on the House floor? The CCP attempts to eliminate minority peoples through forced abortion and sterilization. Where's the outrage from across the aisle? There are 30 million more men in China than women due to forced abortions in the one-child policy, the result of big government socialism. And yet again, my friends from across the aisle will refuse to condemn socialism. I want to yield 3 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Georgia, the good doctor, Representative Rich McCormick.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I can understand why there's some confusion. I understand why we can get distracted by foreign nations and communism, which most of us agree is a bad thing. What I think is enlightening, though, is how we opened. And what was stated in my understanding or recollection was that it was just said that the last democratically controlled Congress was the most effective and productive in recent history, which you just agreed to. The standard that this statement was made, though, and measured by, shows why we're having this discussion, why my Democratic colleagues are confused. They equate record spending, record debt, and unprecedented control by government over private business as success. That is why they're confused about what this bill is about and why it is germane. They do not understand what socialism is, or worse, don't recognize that their policies are in direct support of socialist leanings. Their policies have continuously placed government in position to control businesses, picking winners and losers, and decide what is moral and immoral, and continues to advance the idea that government somehow should have been empowered to solve the very problems that it created. To clear things up and to create less confusion, we're trying to counter a movement that is moving towards something we have never been, a socialist nation. We are a unique government created by the people, for the people, empowered to protect, not to provide for, and not to determine the outcome for people's endeavors. We're uniquely positioned to benefit our citizens by empowering them, not through more government. And I believe that we, the people, are far more valuable than we, the government. And that is why we speak against bigger government and socialism. With that, I yield.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, let me just, to the gentleman who just spoke, who talked about record debt, yeah, we worry about that as well, but I will remind him that 25% of this nation's debt was accumulated in the 4 years of Donald Trump. Let me repeat that. A quarter of our nation's debt, total in all of our history, was accumulated in the 4 years of Donald Trump. So if that's the standard, if you know, increasing debts are the standard where you say a president failed, then there is no question that the previous president, Mr. Trump, was a miserable failure. And let me say to my colleague from Pennsylvania who brought up China, again, I'm so having trouble following this debate. I will not be lectured by anybody on commitment to human rights in China. I co-chaired the Congressional Executive Commission on China. I co-chaired the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I authored the bill, the Uyghur Labor Force Prevention Act, by the way, which died in a Republican Senate, and we managed to get it passed in a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. I have passed major legislation on behalf of the Tibetan people. And by the way, this is all happening now under President Xi of China. And I'm looking in this resolution, and there's no mention of President Xi. So, you know, we're debating issues that aren't even in this resolution. I mean, this is nuts. But I do want to get back to the other bill, the bill that my colleagues are bringing to take Representative Ilhan Omar off her at the Foreign Affairs Committee. I read in some of the publications that to get votes, the Republican leaders apparently promised some of their Republican members who were concerned about this process that there would be some due process put in place. And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement released yesterday by Representative Spartz about what supposedly is in this resolution.
Objection.
The
objection.
The statement touts due process language that was supposedly added to the resolution. And I have to admit, I'm completely lost here. There is nothing, let me repeat that, nothing, one more time, nothing in this resolution that provides due process. And, don't take my word for it. In Politico today, and I have a nice quote here for people to follow along with me, it says, there's a quote, "The whereas clause added merely references an existing process and in no way begins an appeal procedure or guarantees her committee seat will be reconsidered. It is non-binding and non-actionable." And that is according to a senior GOP aide in a comment that they made to Politico. To whoever that senior GOP aide is, let me just say thank you for your candor. I think it's appreciated. And to people like the gentlewoman from Indiana and others who somehow think that they negotiated some sort of due process here, you didn't get anything. And if you think you did, then you're a cheap date. So with that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no more. I have no further speakers at this time. I'm prepared to close, and I'd reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time. And I assume the gentleman has no more speakers, right?
Further speaker.
Okay, thank you.
Ranking member. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to reiterate the long list of reasons that these resolutions are a waste of time, and quite frankly, they're an insult to the intelligence of the American people. Let me be clear. This socialism resolution is useless. It does nothing. It does not matter. Who the hell cares how anybody votes on it? But we're here for one reason, and we're here for one reason only. My Republican colleagues are pushing an extreme far-right agenda that benefits the rich and powerful and screws over working families and everyone else. They are not paying attention to the problems of everyday people, and that is clear based on the recent polling that has come out that shows just how out of touch they are with where people are at all around this country. They are not paying attention to the kitchen table issues that people anguish over every night. And I can assure you, I don't care what part of the country you come from, people aren't sitting around the table talking about Pol Pot. But anyway, that's what my Republican friends think is a national priority. We're talking about socialism in this resolution, but we're not talking about a definition or what it is. Are we talking about public schools? Are we talking about roads? Are we talking about Social Security? I mean, give me a break. We've been hearing this stuff for decades and decades. Republicans saying Democrats want socialism. And it's always some big scary takeover that's just over the horizon that everyone needs to be afraid of. When you don't have any good issues on your side and fear is all you have, that's what you run with, I guess. And that's the Republican playbook. You know what's funny is that the same Republicans who decry anything that government does as socialism never seem to have a problem when it comes to huge handouts for billionaire corporations. They want socialism for the rich, but capitalism for the poor. Now, call me crazy, but here's what I think. This resolution is not about socialism. It is about scaring people. It is about dividing people. And quite frankly, I think, based on what happened in the Rules Committee last night, it is about setting the stage to go after the social safety net in this country, which includes Social Security and Medicare. If that wasn't the case, why in the world would my Republican friends not allow a clarifying amendment to make it clear that that was not the intent? They all voted no. And when it comes to Congresswoman Omar, a good congresswoman who fights hard for her district and for her values, this isn't about punishing her for anything she said. It's about scoring political points. If this was about condemning anti-Semitism, Republicans would be condemning the folks on your side who dine with Holocaust deniers and appear at white supremacy rallies. If this was about condemning anti-Semitism, Republicans would have accepted our amendment to condemn the Nazis who slaughtered 6 million Jews during World War II, and every one of them voted no. So please spare us the false equivalence. This is total BS, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this rule. This is really a sad day for this chamber, with all that needs to be done. With all that needs to be done, this is the priority. This is the priority. And I should add, for good measure, all of this is being brought to you under closed rules. All the amendments that were offered, all the suggestions that were brought on this and other bills by Democrats and Republicans were all ruled out of order. I mean, some of this is non-controversial stuff, all closed. And the issue with Congresswoman Omar was brought to the Rules Committee as an emergency. I mean, an emergency? I mean, really? I don't get it. But I shouldn't be surprised, because the last time the Republicans were in charge, they brought a bill to the floor as an emergency to deal with cheese curd. So I get it. Everything is an emergency, especially when it comes to messaging and making political statements. But look, we have to get back to the people's business, Mr. Speaker. We have to get back to focusing on kitchen table issues, the stuff that people worry about every night. This is not it. This is not it. And I really regret that we're wasting this time on these poorly crafted bills that do nothing to help anybody in this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in the spirit of rebuttal, I'd like to address some of the comments made by my friend across the aisle. The spending under President Trump. There was spending under President Trump, but you know what? He also had a pandemic that we haven't seen in the last 100 years. So where's the excuse for the $1.7 trillion that was just rammed through? You want to talk about closed rules, things not going through regular order? That $1.7 trillion was rammed through. It was architected, it didn't even go through the Senate Appropriations Committee. It was rammed through by 2 senators that are no longer here who had zero accountability to the American public. What about Build Back Better? Where's the excuse for that? All Build Back Better did was increase inflation, hurt workers who have wages that aren't keeping pace with inflation. And what about the Recession and Inflation Act? Where's the excuse for that and why we had rampant spending there? There is no excuse for it. Let's talk about China. To paraphrase Marcus Aurelius, it's not about one's words, it's about their deeds. Let's talk about the deeds of my friends across the aisle. 3 years ago or so, my good friend, the Speaker of the House, put together he wanted to put together a select committee on China. And he was strung along by my friends across the aisle. Finally, the Speaker had to move forward on his own as the minority Republican leader to put together the China Task Force. I was privileged to be on the task force. You know how many Democrats were on that task force? Exactly 0. 0 Democrats joined that task force. So it's quite amazing how I hear that the Democrats want to condemn China, but when they had the chance to have a select committee to address the threat of China, they won't go along with it. When they had the chance to join a task force explicitly put together to combat China and their malign influences on the world, 0 of them joined that task force. So spare me the talk on China. We've seen how you treated China. No, it's my time. Thank you. Let's talk about the definition, playing these silly games that we can't define socialism and communism. We all know, we're all educated. We all know what socialism is. We all know what communism is. So spare me the fact that socialism isn't defined in this bill. This is especially rich from the party, my friends across the aisle, who for the last 2 years couldn't even define basic terms like what is a woman. And that's not just me saying that. Let's talk about Justice Brown Jackson. She was asked during confirmation to define a woman. And you know what her response was? I quote, "No, I can't." So the party that can't define a woman now wants to sit here and say that we can't define socialism and communism? We all know what this is. And let's talk about, lastly, Representative Ilhan Omar and due process. I know there was a display put up regarding due process. It's quite amazing how my friends across the aisle have now discovered the principle of due process after 2 years of one-party rule here in Washington, D.C. 2 years where due process wasn't followed at all. Where was the due process for my good friend from Georgia when she was removed from all her committees? And again, that's all her committees. We're only removing Representative Ilhan Omar from Foreign Affairs. Where was the due process for my good friend Dr. Gozar when he was removed, again, from all his committees? There wasn't one Democrat who stood up and talked about due process. But miraculously, now we found due process when the Republicans are moving somebody from a committee, one committee, for anti-Semitic remarks and a pattern of anti-Semitic remarks for that. But let's just go back and talk about socialism. Let me be clear. Socialism must never take root in America. President Trump himself said, America will never be a socialist nation. These are words we should all rally around. We should all support that. But for too long, Democrats have fought this far-left authoritarian agenda, regardless of the regimes across the globes that commit acts of violence and oppression against their own people in its name. Experiments with socialism have led to painful human tragedy. We're talking about starvation, imprisonment without due process, I might add, and mass murder. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system. It's capitalism that's the way out of poverty, not socialism, not communism. 200 years ago, at the birth of capitalism, there were only about 600 million people in the world who were not living in extreme poverty. Today, due to the advance of capitalism, there are more than 6.5 billion people who are not living in extreme poverty. It was free market capitalism that led the way here, not government-controlled socialism. Since 1970, the percentage of the world's population living on the equivalent of less than $1 a day has fallen by more than 80%. Instead of millions starving to death due to socialism and communism, capitalism has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of despair. Socialism and anti-Semitism have absolutely no place in America. For those reasons, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the previous question and yes on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.